Okay, thank you, Carol. I ask everybody to please mute. There are a few of you out there that are not muted, and we're picking up a little bit of extraneous sound. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. And it is World Water Day. And so the theme of this year's World Water Day, every year the UN picks a theme. It's the value of water. And we know the value of water is very high. Hard to actually quantify, but high value. Next year's World Water Day will actually be, the theme will be groundwater, which is something very important to us here in Arizona. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I do have a slide presentation to prepared for you. I would ask that you put in questions. I know that we'll have a Q&A session for at least a half hour. I'm going to watch the time as I go along. But I would note that, Carol, I don't know if you remember when we did first meet, but I believe it may have been when I was on the State Transportation Board or working on transportation issues. And I believe you were working for Sedona at the time. And I mention that because I've done a number of different things since I've been a member of the Corporation Commission. And one of the things that is very apparent in our beautiful, large state is that communities are diverse. They have their individual characteristics. And water is something that in many ways is both local and not local. And so the issues and challenges may vary by community, but what I want to do today is give you kind of a broad overview of some of the issues and some of the challenges, and then bring it to a little bit more local level for a little bit of time, and then talk about kind of the pathway forward. And I hope leaving you on a somewhat encouraging note. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I will do that here. And I will start my presentation. And so I hope you're all, I hope you're all now seeing my title slide here. Somebody just say no if you're not. And if I don't hear anything, we're good to go. So I'm going to talk about wicked water problems, and I'm going to explain in a moment what this concept of wicked problems means. And so I'm going to talk about Arizona and our region, because we can't really talk about Arizona without talking about the Colorado River Basin. So today is World Water Day. I've mentioned that. We're hosting a program here at 3:30 in the afternoon, and it's not too late to register, so I thought I'd just mention that on managed aquifer recharge, something very important throughout the state and in especially central Arizona. And I do hail from the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona, where I serve as director. I've been director here for about 16 years, over 16 years. I've been at the Water Center since 2002. As you can see from the photo, and some of you who may know Tucson, we're slightly off campus, just southeast of the football stadium in the old Boy Scouts building. And you can see the emblem of the Boy Scouts is be prepared. And I often point out that that's a good motto for an organization that's working on water management and being prepared for the future. We do a lot of work that's applied, connected to real world practice of water management. We host webinars like this one, where we feature sometimes some of our own staff as speakers, but more often guest speakers. And you can keep up with all that we do, if you'd like, and be aware of our events by subscribing to our weekly wave. And this, you'll see throughout, I provide our website. We have a lot of good information about water in Arizona posted on our website. And if you just add subscribe to the end of it, we'd love to have you subscribe to our weekly wave. So we're talking today about water problems, water management, water policy. And this is a slide that I use in the first gathering each spring semester when I teach my graduate class in water policy. And I use this in many presentations. And it's important to just remember there's a lot that goes into determining what we see in the practice of water management. And here I list several of the items, and some of them are obvious: the location of water demands and supplies, the economics, politics and values. But there are a couple that I've underlined, and I underline these all the time, and that is the historic and current legal institutional framework. And then this whole question of kind of where is decision-making centered? Where are the regulations determined? Are they centralized versus decentralized? And in the United States, though the federal government may establish water quality standards for drinking and discharging into waterways, other regulations, particularly when it comes to in-state water, is left to the individual states. So you see a lot of difference across the US and then within states, depending upon the practices of the state. And I like to highlight the importance of context. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about context. And of course, we've got to remember the water cycle context. No new water is created. It may change quality, form, may move around in location. I like this kind of graphic I like to show because not all areas in the United States or the world depend upon groundwater like we do to a significant extent here in Arizona. And so we have aquifers where we have water interspersed with granular materials, and it's not a pristine lake underground. And you know, we use pumps to pump that water, and that the surface water and the groundwater are connected. And then the geographic context is very important. And so here's a map of the Colorado River Basin. You see most of Arizona falls within the hydrologic boundaries. The hydrologic boundaries are this dark outline, if you can see my cursor here in the dark black. And the basin spans parts of 7 US states and the Republic of Mexico. But the water is not only used within the hydrologic boundaries of the basin, the water is pumped out to Southern California, Albuquerque, Denver, Salt Lake City, the major metropolitan areas of the region. And it's estimated about 40 million people depend upon Colorado River water to some extent. And you know, here we have, this is, you know, with this audience, everybody should recognize Hoover Dam and the bridge. I like to use this in presentations, especially with international audiences when they're in person. I'll often ask how many of you have been to Hoover Dam, and you'd be surprised how many people around the world have been to Hoover Dam. And there, of course, we see Lake Mead behind it with the bathtub rings, you know, that give us some indication of the level of the lake. And then again, geographic context is important for us here in Arizona because we do share a border with Mexico. And so this provides a good geographic locator map for people who may not be familiar with where Arizona is. And this is a map here, that's our water map poster. This is version 4.0 that we've prepared. This one's now going on almost 5 years old. The difference between this map and another map I'll show you in just a minute is this map focuses on the water features of Arizona. And I'm going to come back more to this as we go through the presentation. But I did want to stop here and give a little snapshot of Arizona. We're at about 7.2 million people. We're experiencing and have experienced robust population growth. Water use is estimated to be about 7 million acre feet a year, and that's been pretty steady for several years now. So although the population's been growing, in many cases, overall, the water use has not been growing. And in fact, if you look at what's been happening in many of the Western cities in the US and particularly in Arizona, on a per capita basis, water use has been declining in many instances. And what's an acre foot? An acre foot is a Western US measure of water. It's the amount of water that covers an acre 1 foot deep. It's about 326,000 gallons, a little below that. It's a strange measure because other than in the Western United States, people don't use it. I mean, even in the Midwest and Eastern United States, they'll talk about millions of gallons per day. Most of the world uses cubic meters and millions of cubic meters. In Australia, they use gigaliters. And so, you know, this is a Western peculiarity to talk about acre feet. Of the water used in the state, about 40%, more than 40% nowadays comes from groundwater. About 3 growing to 4% of the total water use pie is reclaimed or recycled water. And then the remaining use is surface water. And that could include water from the Colorado River along the main stem, which is the western boundary of Arizona, or delivered through the Central Arizona Project, which is a 336-mile canal that pushes water uphill from Lake Havasu to south of Tucson. Notice I use the word has been for the 2.8 million acre feet because we're in the middle now of our tier 0 shortage, now again in 2021 and in 2020. But up until then, there'd been about 2.8 million acre feet delivered from the Colorado River to users in Arizona. And you do have the Central Arizona Project that was built to deliver 1.5 to 1.6 million acre feet annually. So more water being taken off the river and transported into Central Arizona that then is used on the river itself. Statewide, approximately 70% of the water is diverted or extracted by agriculture. The more rapidly growing water uses, though, of the municipal sector. And when it comes to groundwater, and we're going to talk about groundwater a bit here today, groundwater is managed only in designated active management areas. Those are known as AMAs per the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And I'll mention there are a few irrigation non-expansion areas, excuse me, I left off the word irrigation there. But absent that, we do not practice groundwater management. And it's notable that our groundwater laws and our surface water laws are not integrated. So if you think back to that water cycle graphic I showed you a few minutes ago, the nature doesn't recognize a distinction between the groundwater system and the surface water system. They're related, but our laws do not have them integrated. Now, I'll say a little bit more about the Groundwater Management Act. And I realize I'm speaking by and large to a group of people from the Verde Valley. You're not in an active management area, and from the Flagstaff area, you're not in an active management area. But I've seen some names of folks that I recognize when I was looking at the participant list who live in maybe the Phoenix area. I live in Tucson. We're in active management areas in Prescott. The Prescott area is an active management area. And so I want to talk about that a little bit because there's a contrast between how groundwater is managed within the active management areas and outside the active management areas. So these active management areas had management goals. In most of them, it's safe yield, meaning that there's an attempt to achieve and thereafter maintain a balance between groundwater withdrawals and natural and artificial recharge. It created those irrigation non-expansion areas. I'm going to show you a map in just a moment. It quantified rights for existing groundwater users. Some rights are transferable, others are not. It required a series of management plans, and a key component of the management plans are conservation programs for the municipal, industrial, and agricultural sectors. It restricted new groundwater uses, but grandfathered in at the time most uses. The footprint of agriculture could not expand in the active management areas, and that's the key characteristic of these irrigation non-expansion areas. They looked at where there had been agricultural irrigation for the 5 years prior to the Groundwater Management Act, or an INA, Irrigation Non-Expansion Area, being established, and that determined what could be what land could be irrigated. It placed the burden of using renewable supplies on new residential uses through requiring an assured water supply program. That assured water supply program later became codified through a set of rules or regulations through Arizona's administrative code. Interestingly, for the AMAs, they were established in 1980, but the rules, the assured water supply rules, were not permanently codified until 1995, and they've been amended in some cases since then. Later legislation authorized recharge and recovery program, and I just put here the definitions of recharge. Simplest is the process of adding water to an aquifer. The natural recharge is what occurs from natural processes, snowpack, snow melt, stream flow. Incidental recharge is water that enters the aquifer after human uses, such as irrigation uses or leaks in water pipes and water lines. And then artificial recharge is where you're actively taking actions for the purpose of adding water to an aquifer. So just some definitions and some basic framework. So here are some maps again to talk about that geographic context. This is a blow up of the map I showed you on our water map poster. A note, the green here are the agricultural areas around the state of Arizona. So you've got some here in the southeast. In the last 5 years, it's probably gotten a little greener. There's more going in the southeastern part of the state. You've got the central Arizona agriculture, some of which is being urbanized. You've got some to the west of the Phoenix area through Gila Bend, and then out toward Yuma, you've got Colorado River Indian tribes, you've got some north. And, you know, when the map was done, the green doesn't show up, but of course you've got some irrigated activities going on up in your area. This map here to the right is one that shows a little bit more easily to see, easy to the eye, these active management areas. Starting from the south, you've got Santa Cruz, which used to be part of the Tucson AMA. When the Tucson AMA was first established in 1980, broke off in 1994. You've got the Pinal AMA, which is basically the historically agricultural area between Tucson and Phoenix. Phoenix AMA, Prescott AMA, and then you've got these 3 irrigation non-expansion areas. Just a couple things to note here is that you'll see by looking at these black county boundaries that the AMA boundaries do not follow county boundaries. They're meant to follow hydrologic boundaries. And so you can have an AMA spanning more than one county and not an entire county. And then the other thing I'd say to note here is look at all that's not color, the tannish, brownish area. Those are areas where there is no groundwater regulation. The only thing is that you must file a notice of intent to drill a well. Another thing geographically that's important for our context here in the state of Arizona is looking at the lands that are tribal lands. The tribes have sovereign authorities, they're sovereign nations when it comes to water management. And you can see here on the right, you know, we have significant land areas that are tribal areas. And this map on the left is a map of the Colorado River Basin that I showed you earlier, with the focus rather than on the 7 states and the international boundary with Mexico, focused on the tribal boundaries. And we have tribal nations that span 2 or more states. And so for them, there's a lot that comes into play because so much is focused on the states when they as nations may span more than one state. And then I wanted to blow up a couple of these side maps that are on our water map poster. And this one here on the left is kind of the source. What is the source of the water being used in different parts of the state? And here's where you see quite a bit of diversity. You know, I said earlier that over 40% of the water use in Arizona is groundwater, but some areas it could be 100%. In some areas, it could be virtually 0%. And so these different colors, this kind of bluish color here in the Yuma area, these are basins where 75% or more of the water use is sourced by surface water. On the other hand, these teal greenish colored areas are basins where more than 75% is groundwater sourced. And then the rest of the state, it's a mix. And the pie charts show the relative size of the different areas. So a lot of diversity around the state that is masked by looking at state averages, certainly relevant when you're looking at the local situation. And then on the right is the map showing the different types of land ownership around the state. And if you see the private lands, you know, this really drives home the limited amount of land in the state of Arizona that is privately held versus federal lands, this kind of salmon-y color. Tribal lands are green, and then local jurisdictional lands, including state lands, are blue. So again, quite a lot of diversity across the state. And I've talked quite a bit about the Colorado River watershed, a very important watershed within the state of Arizona, and certainly in your region is the Salt River Project watershed. And it's wholly within the boundaries of Arizona. So some of the complexities that arise with Colorado River water management do not arise here because you're not dealing with an interstate system. And it's quite large, as you can see. And the green here is the watershed. The gray down here is the service area that the waters serve. And this is just another map that maybe is a little less busy that shows the Salt and Verde watersheds, and again, the service area here. And so this is relevant to the water situation in the Verde River. So transitioning now to talking about wicked water problems. And this is something that I first was introduced to the concept back in 2016 at one of our annual conferences, where we had a guest speaker talk about wicked water problems. And I found it quite intriguing. And in the last year or more, they've really talked a lot in this context or about this context, because it helps me understand, and I think it helps us all understand, that we can't expect quick fixes or singular fixes to what are very complex problems. And so Lisa Buehler back then in her talk talked about how these problems defy standard solutions. And she gave some reasons for that. And as shown here, you know, there might be incomplete knowledge. There can be different opinions involved. There could be large economic burdens. And sometimes these problems can be connected to other problems, bigger problems, be it geopolitical problems. I do some work in the Middle East, and clearly geopolitics will come into play, poverty. And very recently, there's a volume, a magazine put out by the American Water Resources Association that I co-guest edited with Lisa about wicked water problems. So if anybody's interested in it, you can download it for free. Again, my slides will be made available. And one of the reasons I put all these links in is in case any of you want to go back and find some of these sources. So the wicked water problems are not solved. They tend to be mitigated. Much collaboration is necessary for working out effective pathways to solutions. And it's a new kind of work. It often requires changing the questions or expectations. And it requires ongoing efforts and processes. And through some of these slides I'll be showing in the next few minutes, you'll see that I highlight in this color some text related to words and processes. And I thought maybe some of you might like to place in the chat what you consider wicked water problems. I'm going to give a few examples, but I'm always interested in what others articulate, which was part of what went into creating this issue of water resources impact. So here are some examples that I'm going to speak to from the Colorado River Basin. I mentioned I do some work in the Middle East, and I sometimes will give examples from there, but today I'm going to keep closer to home here. And so the four examples I'll talk about briefly are the imbalance of water demand and supply in the Colorado River Basin, groundwater overdraft and invisibility, lack of attention to water for nature or environmental flows, and lack of water and water infrastructure. So I'll talk about each one of these in turn. So I'm sure, even though you may not live in areas served Colorado River water, you are aware that the Colorado River Basin is experiencing long-term drought, climate change impacts, whatever you want to call it. It's been going on now since about 2000. So we're over 20 years into experiencing well below average runoff precipitation and inflows into the lower basin where we're located. And this is a picture I took, this is from May 2019, when the drought contingency plan documents were signed at Hoover Dam. And if you look back, you'll see there are times in history where the water's all the way up to the high level of these spillways here and these towers, and it's very low. Because of the poor hydrology connected with the over allocation of the river compared to historically measured flows, we've experienced low levels of storage in our two basic storage reservoirs, Lake Mead for the lower basin and Lake Powell for the upper basin. And in 2007, recognizing that there had been no regulations governing the sharing of shortage, the Secretary of the Interior signed these interim shortage sharing guidelines that are to be in effect from 2007 through 2026. And they created these tiers based on the lake levels or the levels of water in Lake Mead above sea level. And so since 2007, and between 2007 and 2018-19, we in Arizona were doing what we could to help keep levels at 1075 or above, because once the lake level hit 1075, mandated decreases would go into effect. And Arizona was, Central Arizona was the primary bearer of the burden of reduced deliveries because of the Central Arizona project's low priority among the lower basin water users, which is something that we had to live with in order to get the Central Arizona project funded. And so we'd been, knowing that we had these tiers, and if you look at this left side of this bar chart here, or this stacked block chart, This is a chart showing the relative priorities of users of Central Arizona project water from the most secure at the bottom foundation to the least secure. And you see that if there would be a tier 1 shortage, it would cut into what's called other excess and into what's called an ag pool. And as you went down the tiers, more and more of that ag pool went away. But these other priorities were pretty well protected: municipal and industrial, Indian priority, and a priority called non-Indian agriculture. But things were looking pretty bleak in the latter part of the last decade. And people realized that it's going to be difficult to keep those lake levels propped above 1075. And rather than let bad things happen and let the system crash, which is basically the word people used, and deal with the uncertainty. These guidelines didn't say what happens if the lake level goes below 1025. We better intervene and do something to give us some more predictability. And so the DCP, or the DCPs, the drought contingency plans, are basically an overlay. And a lot of effort in Arizona went into figuring out how we in Central Arizona in particular would spread the burden of some increased cuts. And so a tier 0 was agreed upon, meaning if the lake level is predicted to be below 1090 or below, as of January 1, and this look is done in August of the prior year, there will be this tier 0 cut of, turns out to be 192,000 acre feet. So all this excess goes away. And this was used for water banking and other purposes. And there's this little cut into the ag pool. But then what this does is it pushes down these other tiers. So now if there's a tier 1 then would eliminate all of the ag pool and start getting into this tier of non-Indian agricultural priority. And if you got as low as a tier 3, you start getting into Indian priority and municipal and industrial priority water where this hadn't happened before. So here we are in March of 2021, 2020 and 2021 experienced tier 0. The probability of a tier 1 is looking to be pretty good, which is not a good thing, but the probabilities are high. And so there are a lot of issues coming up. And I know there are some people who submitted some questions in advance about what do these cutbacks mean. And so maybe in the Q&A, we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that. But I want to talk about some other things before we get there. So I'm going to move on after this slide to talking about some other of the wicked water problems. But the point I want to make here with this slide is that it took a lot of people, a lot of negotiation involving US and Mexico. They have their own agreement through Amendment to the treaty, the state governments, all of the stakeholders. And particularly in Arizona, we needed a process because the legislature had to act before our key, our primary negotiator and signer of documents, who is the Department of Water Resources Director, Tom Bishotsky, could sign. There was just a whole lot of effort. And so this gets back to the point of process. There had been for a short while a breakdown in some collaborations, but people came together as people typically do in Arizona. They sat down and they worked hard to figure out something that, very few were happy with, but people could live with. And so there was the DCP steering committee, which has now been reconstituted into the Arizona Reconsultation Committee, because as I noted, those shortage sharing guidelines expire in 2026. And for all that has to happen for a new set of regulations and guidelines to be put in effect as of the end of these interim shortage sharing guidelines, work has to be done pretty soon to to get it all in place. So Arizona's losing no time in working on that. Now, moving along, and I'll be going more quickly through these 3 additional wicked water problems. To the second one here is groundwater overdraft and invisibility. And this is an issue across the world, actually, that populations are growing, the need for more food is growing, need for water for people and for agriculture is growing. And in many cases, the dependence is on fossil groundwater. It's on groundwater that is not being replenished anywhere close to the rate at which it's being used. And oftentimes, you don't even know how much is there because of its invisibility and the costs and complexities involved in trying to model and measure. And so the particular example I sometimes will talk about at more length than I'm going to talk about here is in central Arizona in the Pinal active management area, which doesn't have a safe yield goal. Remember earlier I mentioned the AMAs have management goals that are in statute. Their management goal is different from safe yield, and it allows drawdown on aquifers to a greater extent than the other active management areas. And so there's some real issues here about the extent to which community development can occur given the groundwater modeling and the projections on use and the like. And so there's again a group that's been formed. Again, process is very important to try to figure out both what could be done around the kind of edges of the big problem, and then what to do longer term about the problem. This is a group that's formed in addition to the statewide Governor's Water Augmentation, Innovation, and Conservation Council. And this council is a council looking at statewide water issues of many types, including water issues faced outside the AMAs. Now, water for nature is also an issue within Arizona, within our communities, across the country, across the globe. And this is a situation where there's very limited legal protections for riparian areas in and of themselves. There's recently been some legislation passed that changes things a little bit. I think I mentioned that on a later slide. So let me just check here, because I know, yes, I do. So I'll come back to that. But in this case, the example I use is the example of the pulse flow. Because like the United States, Mexico takes its Colorado River water and sends it west from the delivery point from the US to Mexico. If you look on the bottom right here, I've got my cursor showing that. And it doesn't reach the natural end or the delta of the Colorado River. And so this pulse flow, which was a one-time thing, sent water down there. And this is a video. There's a beautiful video that's been, it's narrated by Robert Redford. Again, I provide the link to it here. So if anybody wants to go watch it, it's less than 10 minutes. But this is a photo of a beautiful little girl in the Colorado River area where there's usually dry sand. And so hard to talk about World Water Day and the value of water to say the value of that kind of experience for the people in that community. Now, the fourth one that is what I mentioned here is basically water availability and water access. And certainly COVID-19 has brought greater attention to a chronic issue on the Navajo Nation, which is the lack of plumbing to people's homes for their kitchens, for toilets. And, you know, as you may know from reading the news, this has been very serious as people were asked to wash their hands for 20 seconds and to maintain social distance. It's hard to do when you have multi-generations living in homes and without running water. And this, you might say, could be something that could be solved with money and time, but we're not there yet. A lot of work needs to be done to get there. Okay, so moving on now to your region. I've given kind of a, I hope, a big picture view of some of these issues that people are grappling with in a very serious way. So here you are. This is again a blow up of the water map poster section. And you've got the Prescott AMA here, but the Verde Valley area and its communities are not within an AMA. And then of course you've got Flagstaff here. And as I noted, you don't have groundwater regulations other than notice of intent to drill a well. You have adequate water supply rules rather than assured water supply rules. And what is the implication of that? The assured water supply rules require a demonstration of 100 years of physically, legally, continuously available water of appropriate quality and the financial means to provide that water. In certain AMAs, it requires the significant use of renewable supplies. And for Tucson, that's mainly Central Arizona Project water. And in order to subdivide more than 5 parcels, you have to either be served by a designated water provider, a water provider that's been designated to have an assured water supply, or be in a development, buying a home from a development that has a certificate of assured water supply. That's required in order to move forward with these developments. An adequate water supply showing also, it must go through the Department of Water Resources. They are the regulatory body that ensures compliance with these rules. Shows that there's an adequate water supply to serve the area or not. And in most counties, even without an adequate water supply, a development could go forward provided there's a notice to the first purchaser that there's not an adequate water supply. What often happens is if the department rules there's a problem in showing an adequate water supply, a developer may come back and revisit the density of homes, number of homes, things like that, to demonstrate an adequate water supply. But there was a big issue maybe 15 years ago or more about whether or not counties and local jurisdictions could take into account demonstration of adequate water supply when they subdivide lands or approve developments of lands. And it was determined that counties could in fact establish such an ordinance if there were a unanimous vote of the Board of Supervisors. And that's sometimes a hard threshold to pass through. And last I checked, my information may not be up to date. I think it was Cochise and Yuma counties were the 2 counties that had passed such an ordinance. And there are some local communities, cities and towns that have, but my information on that may not be up to date. So that's where I noted here county authorities compared to those of cities and towns. Counties have authorities as delegated to them by the state legislature, where cities and towns may have greater authorities based on their charters. I wanted to note here something that you all know, that Verde River flows are monitored carefully by many. I didn't single out Salt River Project, but we know Salt River Project monitors Verde Valley flows. And I would say it's likely because of the senior surface water rights that you have the water you do in the Verde River, as opposed to some of the other rivers of the state that have been dried up by groundwater pumping. The issue of conservation programs, really then, because you're not in an AMA that has certain requirements in the management plans for conservation programs, it is really up to local jurisdictions. And I'm aware, Flagstaff has been quite a leader in conservation programs over time. And so again, because these are not they're not necessarily mandated by the state, doesn't mean they don't happen. It's just up to different levels of government for them to happen, such as conservation programs. And effluent reuse and recharge. Again, a local community can require reclaimed water be used for golf courses and turf irrigation. And it can be used for recharge outside AMAs. So there are tools that are available, but it's up to the local jurisdictions to determine how they're implemented. And one thing I didn't put down here is just questions of private versus public ownership. That's throughout the state. Carol mentioned I served on the Corporation Commission back many years ago. Perhaps because of that, and I'm an economist, I've been very interested ever since on some of the differences between publicly operated and privately operated water utilities. And there are some. Privately operated water companies can't adopt ordinances, regarding water use and the like. So I have here water issues wherever you are located. All right, so high level discussion. Want to just mention that there's no shortage of these water issues. And here's a slide that I sometimes use in presentation: water management issues, challenges, and solutions, because some of these items are, they have issues with them, but they're also part of the solution, or can be part of the solution, such as desalination, such as water, the way water is priced and the like. But there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of difference in what's going on. So with all that is going on, it's so important to inform, educate, communicate. It doesn't stop. That's why I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be here today with you. And as I mentioned, this is what I was looking for. Things do change. Sometimes it seems very slowly, but there was a bill that was signed this winter that changed some of the provisions that were commonly called use it or lose it, so that if a conservation plan is submitted to the state, the water right holder doesn't have to use all of the surface water rights and could leave them in the river without risking losing them. I ask, in terms of, if you want to learn more, please consider attending our webinars. We record most and post them on our website. We have a new 2021 Arroyo. Arroyo is our annual publication that we put out. It's been connected to our conference in the last few years. It just was released about 10 days ago. And we got a great email feedback from former Governor and Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt. So that was nice to get. And we do put on annual conference. The first one of the annual, we had a couple conferences before I joined the Water Center that weren't part of this annual series, was actually held in 2003 in Prescott on local approaches to water management. Our 2021 virtual annual conference will be coming up. We usually have them in the spring. This year it's going to be later, August 30th through September 1st. It's going to be virtual. So I hope some of you will make a note. And if you subscribe to our weekly wave, you'll get notices. And finally, I just want to leave you with maybe some encouragement that, or reinforcement that these issues are being worked on, that through functioning cooperative mechanisms, which are so important, through building of trust, mutual respect, involvement of key stakeholders, sometimes a lot of persistence and patience, and being able sometimes to get together. This is something that came out of a panel that I organized for a conference in Tel Aviv involving people from Israel, Mexico, and the Colorado River Basin. What contributes to cooperation or collaboration across boundaries? And they said, eating with your partners, which of course we can't do right now, but hopefully we will be able to again soon. But these are long-term efforts. The work continues, and progress is being made, although these are wicked problems. And I give you here the website for the Governor's Water Augmentation, Innovation, and Conservation Council, which one of its committees is outside the AMA's committee. Again, they're looking at the whole state. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen and look forward to discussion and questions. So thank you very much.
Do you have any time for questions?
Yeah, we're going to 2:30, and I think it is Lynn or Robin. Or Lynn, are you moderating the questions, or Marie? Somebody's moderating them.
Marie.
All right.
Sharon, did you want to start with those first questions that you printed out, or do you want me to read some?
I think it might be good for you to decide, we might, do you think we have time to get through them all? Otherwise we can go in order, or otherwise I'd ask you to maybe choose.
I do not think we will have time to get through all of them, but it does seem kind of fair to go in order.
All right, well, I don't know if everybody knew they could get things in there. Okay. So I did get a few questions in advance. So one of them is, I'll try to give succinct answers, so we'll get to as many as we can. The Verde Valley is not in an active management area, and we follow adequate supplies rules. As more and more people move here, and with the recent annexation by the city of Cottonwood of Spring Creek Ranch, that includes two large tracts of Arizona State Trust lands, do you foresee the adequacy laws changing and the Verde Valley becoming an AMA? So I don't have the crystal ball. There's great aversion to changing some of the fundamental aspects. What I like to say here in answer to the question about the Verde Valley becoming an AMA, over the years, there's been a lot of resistance to forming additional active management areas. People don't like the thought of one size fits all, and they'd like to see a more regionally based framework come to be. And so that's the challenge, I think. Out in southeastern Arizona and Cochise County, there's been a recognition that something should be done about the additional draws on groundwater there, but they're having trouble coming up with the framework. The INA framework doesn't really work as written, and the AMA framework may not work. So then it really becomes up to the creative minds to figure out what to do in a proactive way instead of waiting for the crisis. So what I would say is that if there is a desire in the region to do something, then it will take significant conversation within the region involving elected officials and others, because it will be difficult to get something through the legislature if there's disagreement within the local area itself. And so that's the big challenge in my view. So I'm going to leave that one at that. Carol asked the second question. People have their own wells, exempt wells, are needing to re-drill their wells deeper due to the groundwater levels declining. The Salt River Project is closely monitoring this and claiming they have prior right. Do you see these laws changing? Well, I don't see I don't see rights being taken away from anybody. That would be very, let's say, impossible to do, and I wouldn't argue would be the right thing to do, because in the state of Arizona we have constitutional protections for private property rights and rights. So if there were some effort to take something away, the holder of the right has to be compensated. And I don't foresee that happening. But then I did mention the law. I think you can see tweaks and changes that could help the overall management of the water resources without necessarily harming someone. And so there again, I think we have to think creatively, but I would note that, again, I keep referring to Cochise County because the situation there is a high priority area for the Department of Water Resources and others, is that when you have lack of groundwater use regulations, issues are going to come up where, you know, the deepest, biggest straw is going to get the groundwater, and that can have impacts on others. When you do have certain regulations, you might have well spacing rules like exist in the active management areas and so forth. So I'm not sure I would connect the redrilling of wells to the Salt River Project surface water right issue. I think they're separate issues. There's a question from Mark Alexander. Please describe the water saving measures that will go into place when Lake Mead water levels drop to each of its emergency levels. Also, what point does Arizona development growth end for lack of a guaranteed water supply? Well, the water saving measures in many instances will be up to the local jurisdictions, the entities, the districts that are experiencing the cutbacks, because it's not an across the board cutback. If you go back to that block graphic that I showed you, where the cities are in a different position priority wise than are the agricultural entities. And so these water saving measures, which could be fallowing land for agricultural users, they're being bandied about right now. In Pinal Active Management Area, they're looking at increasing their groundwater pumping, which had been decreasing over a period of time because of the reduction in the surface water supplies. So it's going to be up to jurisdictions. I was just speaking with a student of mine this morning. I have students write a paper. He's writing it connected to the drought planning by the city of Tucson. And cities and towns and some counties have drought plans that are connected to the triggers for Lake Mead. And so they've recognized through existing drought plans that there may have to be actions that go into place. And the state of Arizona developed a drought plan back in 2006 or so timeframe. And then at what point does Arizona development growth end for a lack of a guaranteed water supply? So number one, I will just note something that I like to point out is that when we look at supply, we should not necessarily assume that demand is static or not going to change to recognize changing supply conditions. I think there's a lot that could be done on the demand side to bring that down. Conservation alone may not be enough, but even how we build and design our communities and buildings can have a lot to do with new demand placed on the water supplies. And this issue of Arizona development growth ending for lack of a guaranteed water supply, that's a big question that some people say we got to recognize the limitations of our natural resources and our water, and others that think that human ingenuity and the like will come into play here. So if I were smart enough to have the answer here, I would have stated it a long time ago. That's a huge question. All right, so then I have some questions about arsenic. And there's, how serious is it for mammals, the presence of arsenic? I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there's quite a bit of naturally occurring arsenic throughout Arizona, and especially in your area. There are ways to remove arsenic. I know back from several years ago, there was a kit developed or being circulated by somebody at the University of Montana. I am not a water quality expert, so I'm not going to delve into deep answers to this. And then the last question was, are there Arizona municipalities where reclaimed water use is mandated for landscapes, and who initiates the mandate? And I think the answer is in the question. It would be in the local jurisdiction. So for golf courses or turf irrigation, that would be up to the local jurisdiction to mandate that for development and uses in their area. So that is the, those were the pre-prepared questions. So now I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, I have a question from Ellie. I think you may have already answered this one. It asks, how are the active management, have the active management areas reduced the amount of water being taken from the aquifers?
Okay, so it's through the assured water supply rules. That's the primary way. And so you may remember earlier I said that for showing a 100-year assured water supply, you have to show physically, continuously, legally available water. And I left something out. I left out a very important part, and that is that the water use is consistent with the management plan for the AMA. And so the rules allow that physically available water to be pumped water. It could be pumped water from aquifers, but the consistency with the safe yield management goal requires that a good portion of it must then be replenished. So you can't overdraft groundwater without replacing or replenishing that groundwater. And so it's largely through that mechanism, either direct use of renewable supplies or use of renewable supplies through storage and pumping. This is what Tucson does. It stores the surface water and then pumps it out, or pumping first and then replenishing. But in all of these cases, there has to be an accounting, and reports go into the Arizona Department of Water Resources and says, well, this is the amount of groundwater we pumped, but this will be, subject to replenishment. Or if they store it first and then pumped, it's actually, for the purposes of the report, considered the renewable supply. So that's the key way through the assured water supply rules that the overdraft is being approached. Now, these assured water supply rules do not pertain to agricultural use. They do not pertain to industrial use, where the industries are pumping with their own wells. And so it's not an all-encompassing program of requiring use of renewable supplies.
Okay, here's a question from Craig. Yavapai County continues to state that water availability can't be considered by the Zoning Commission when considering proposals for new development. Is this in fact the case, or can they consider availability of water?
Okay, so I'm not a lawyer, so I'll give you my best answer, but this would have to be double checked with a lawyer, or checked, I'm not even saying. I mentioned earlier that the legislature has authorized counties to adopt an ordinance that would say they can take into account, or must take into account, the availability of the water. And it's my understanding that Yavapai County has not. And so they can't, because they themselves have not adopted an ordinance with a unanimous vote that enables them to do so. If they wanted to, all of them together could adopt that ordinance. Or if somebody didn't like the unanimous vote part, you could go, visit the legislature about potentially changing that.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Just for context, would you give one Middle East example of a wicked water problem?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. A wicked water problem in the Middle East is basically the conditions of the lower Jordan River, which are connected to the condition of the Dead Sea. And the situation there is that you've got 5 riparian states or jurisdictions all pulling on upper Jordan River flows. And then you have, you know, the Bible talks about the mighty Jordan. Well, it's a real trickle. I mean, if I were presenting on that, I could show you pictures and, you know, you could measure the distance across the river in feet probably, and it doesn't look very good quality water. And so you have very limited flows in the lower Jordan River used by multiple jurisdictions. And that is the only inflow into the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is a Dead Sea, but it is a dying, even a worse death because of the low inflows coupled with climate change. There are a lot of similarities to the region, sometimes uncanny similarities. And I was just talking about this with an audience and saying, I think we in the Southwest would kind of maybe have a contest with them as to who's more in the target of climate change, meaning hotter temperatures and changing and potentially drying precipitation patterns. So, and that has all kinds of implications for sinkholes and other things. The other example I might give is how to deal with transboundary issues and wastewater flows between the West Bank and Israel.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thank you. Here's a comment and question from Kim. We all know where this is going in short time. Do you think there will be any restrictions of private well use in the future?
That's this question of privately owned wells and private property. These are really fundamental issues. And I'll go back to that early slide. You know, what are the determining factors for our water policy and management? And listed on there were public values. And we have a very strong foundation in private property rights and the idea that a landowner can drill a well and develop land as, you know, land owned. And so this issue of restrictions on individual well owners is a very fundamental one. It gets to the core of views about private property rights. I would note that I'll tell you one interesting story related to that. And it's from the Tucson area, and it goes back to maybe 2002 to 2005 timeframe or so. And that is water rates. We haven't talked about water rates at all, but water rates are sometimes looked at as a tool to provide incentive to use less water. And so some communities have increasing tiered rates, where the more you use, the more it costs at the margin. And there were some examples here, two different ones I'll mention briefly. In one case, the community or the community water system had increased rates such that an apartment owner realized, well, hey, we'll just take ourselves off the system and we'll drill our own wells. In another case, there were some, in the second one's in Tucson water area, there were some people who were, you know, in a wealthy central city area that were using a lot of water for their swimming pools and landscapes. And they realized that, I could actually drill a well and recover the cost of drilling well pretty quickly and take myself off Tucson water system. And so what it was really disruptive to the planning and the goals. And actually the legislature actually passed a law that stopped people from taking themselves off a system if the water company were willing to serve. So that was a way of, in some limited way, of stopping some drilling of additional wells in a service area. That's different from where you have areas that aren't even served by providers. So there isn't even the option of a provider to come in. And so this issue of what to do about exempt wells, and they proliferate your area up there. And it's a huge one that I would imagine that, and I know it's not an imagination, I know that at least the post-2025 AMA group is dealing with. There's a little issue paper on that. And so the Department of Water Resources website, I gave you the site for the Governor's Water Augmentation Council. I just suggest that you take a look at what's said there about exempt wells within an AMA, and then look at what the non-AMA committee is looking at. Because I have to be honest, I haven't been able to follow the latter.
Okay. How can realistic projections of groundwater reserves be made if groundwater pumping volumes are not required to be reported?
Well, these are good questions. So satellite imagery is providing a big boost to trying to monitor, to some extent, water in storage, right? You've got two things going on here, right? You've got the question of how much water is there in the first instance, the stock of water, and then what's the rate at which it's being used, right? The actual groundwater utilization. And so it's going to be hard if you don't have it measured. Some places sometimes use records on electricity use, but those are not always made available, depend upon local laws and permissions and things like that. So it's hard if you don't know what's being taken out, and you don't know in some cases what's even there. It's hard to determine what your path forward is, but just keep in mind, in many of these areas, we know that groundwater is being used at a more rapid rate than it's being replenished. And there are efforts to model these different areas. It's just that the State Department of Water Resources and others don't have the resources to do them all at once.
All right. Here's a question. What can regular people with no expertise in water do to help?
That's the great question. So I would say know where your water comes from, and I don't mean the tap. It's really important for people to know, does your water come from aquifers? Are they nearby aquifers? Does your water come from a mix of groundwater and surface water? Where is it coming from, and what's happening to wherever it is it's coming from? And then, of course, to be smart users of that water. And, you know, sometimes when we were in a room, if we were in a room together, I might ask the question, how many of you think you have the potential to conserve water? You know, I'll assume you're all very thoughtful, careful water users. But is there room to conserve more? And most of the time, hands will go up. But I will also note that people recognize that if there's more water saved, then water could be spread over more people. And so you get into this growth, no growth debate, where some people say, well, why should I save water if it's only going to be used for the next rooftops? Well, I might just suggest that those rooftops are probably going to be built anyway. And it's, you know, do the right thing and use less water if you can.
Okay. I just have a couple more. Let's see. Israel uses much more efficient irrigation methods than flood irrigation. Do you see a day when Arizona agriculture will be mandated to employ these more efficient methods of irrigation?
I don't know that I see the likelihood of mandates, but I think circumstances are leading agriculture to be more efficient in its water use in many instances. I can't say all instances because, number one, I don't know all instances, and that would be an overstatement. But the cost of water has a lot to do with how it's used. And so in Israel, the whole regulatory approach is totally different from here. It's totally centralized. The same regulatory body sets not only prices, but the quantities. so quantities can be cut back. So it's a very, very different system. But I will say that I see more more attention to efficiency of water use, and that's happening just in the normal course of business. The other thing I want to say is, and I talked about this recently, I want to talk about the conundrum of leaky agriculture. And that is, if agriculture is not efficient in its consumptive use of water and applies more on there, forgetting about evaporative losses, it seeps down into the ground, and that can actually recharge the aquifer, or the tailwater can go flow back into a creek or stream. And so as you get more efficient, that means there's less of that incidental recharge going on. And so you got to understand, back to that whole thing of it being an overall system, you just got to understand, if you do something at one end, you might have some implications somewhere else in the system.
Sharon, I have two more questions. If you can maybe sneak past the 2:30 time limit.
Yeah, I'm okay, but not for too long, because I have a 3:30 event I've got to prepare for.
So. Oh, that's right. Okay, well, it's just two more questions. The first one is, in a county that does not require adequate water supply determination, I am told that the county is still the authority to consider the impacts of water resource development when considering a rezoning request. Can Sharon discuss this authority?
Oh, I'm going to say you probably have stumped me on this question, in that I don't know enough to give an answer to that. And I honestly don't know if that's something that's specific to Yavapai County or Coconino County, or that's just a general thing. I just don't know. I apologize, but I don't know.
Okay, and then the last one. Thank you for your time today. Are you aware of any local governments willing to allow rainwater for domestic use? The challenges are surmountable, but some municipalities rely on the myth that it can't be done here.
Oh, so rainwater, interestingly, and I can't speak to any of your local jurisdictions in rainwater, but Arizona tends to be a permissive state, meaning flexible state, when it comes to using rainwater at the individual household level and gray water systems as well. And so there's if anybody's ever interested in watching the documentary Beyond the Mirage, which was made here at the University of Arizona back in 2016, it's on YouTube for free. It's called Beyond the Mirage. So if you just search that, you'll find it. Toward the end of the movie, and there is some talk about Israel in there, but toward the end of the movie, there's a feature of a gentleman who's actually on the faculty at the University of Arizona, who's totally off grid with his water system. And he talks about how he's able to have his drinking water system, a small swimming pool and all that, served by rainwater. Now, I don't know how well he's doing this past year when we had the driest, I think that was the driest year on record in Tucson in 2020. And so at the individual household level, there's quite a bit of opportunity to use rainwater. And there's very active rainwater systems being let's say promoted. I'm trying to think of a better word. Promoted through some incentives from Tucson Water. There's a group in Tucson called Water Management Group that has community people come together to help each other install systems. So again, I can't speak to maybe some individual situations, but Arizona's pretty good about that. I would say that's not uniform across states. Other states may be more restrictive in how rainwater, such as Colorado, may be more restrictive in terms of how rainwater is being used. Now, if you go to the macro level, and this was something of great interest up in your area, macro rainwater harvesting, that's a different story. There's a lot of difference in opinion about that and how to quantify what what is available and the like. But I don't think the question was relating to that, but I did want to mention that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone in the audience for your great questions. And Professor Megdal, thank you so much for all the information and for sharing that with us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.